The Potomac River was low for June, a thin ribbon of brown water cutting through green Maryland fields. On the morning of the 27th, the lead elements of the Army of Northern Virginia waded across, their boots sinking into the soft mud of the far bank, Pennsylvania. Union soil. They came in a column that stretched for miles. 75,000 men in worn gray and butternut brown, the dust from their marching coating everything like a second skin. They moved up the Chambersburg Pike, a hard-packed dirt road that ran east toward a scattering of quiet farm towns. The feeling was unmistakable, an army far from home following a leader they trusted into territory they did not know. They had beaten this Union army before, at Chancellorsville, at Fredericksburg. Confidence was a tangible thing, as real as the weight of their rifles. Their commander, Robert E. Lee, rode among them. At 56, he was the picture of calm authority, his gray beard neatly trimmed, his uniform immaculate amidst the grime of the column. But beneath that calm, a critical problem festered. He was blind. His cavalry, his eyes were missing. J.E.B. Stuart had taken the bulk of the Confederate horsemen on a sweeping ride around the Union Army, chasing glory and leaving Lee to grope forward into Pennsylvania without knowing where his enemy was. Then a man arrived at headquarters, covered in road filth. He was not a soldier. He was an actor-turned-spy named Harrison, hired by Longstreet's intelligence chief. He had come from the east, moving at night, and what he told Lee changed everything. The Union Army of the Potomac was not, as Lee believed, still south of the Potomac, dawdling in Virginia. It was north. It was already in Maryland, and it was moving fast. Its new commander, George Meade, had only held the job for 3 days, but he was pushing his men in a relentless forced march, aiming to put himself between Lee and the cities Lee threatened, Harrisburg, Philadelphia. Lee stood in a farmhouse parlor, maps spread on a table. The reports from his other scouts were vague, contradictory. But this civilian spy, this man from the shadows, spoke with a dreadful clarity. The enemy was closer than anyone had dreamed. The wide, comfortable invasion route was collapsing. Lee had a decision to make: concentrate his army, scattered across south-central Pennsylvania for supplies, or risk being cut to pieces. He made his choice. Orders went out in the fading light. The long gray columns snaking through the Pennsylvania countryside would turn. They would converge. Not on Harrisburg, not on Philadelphia. On a small, unremarkable crossroads town where 10 roads met, a place most of his men had never heard of. A place called Gettysburg. The collision was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty, and the clock was already ticking. The clock was ticking down from hours to minutes, while Lee's infantry turned its dusty columns toward Gettysburg. Another force was racing to the same spot from the south. The Union cavalry under a grim, black-bearded brigadier named John Buford. His command 2,500 horsemen, riding on mounts so tired their necks were dark with sweat lather. They pushed through the pre-dawn darkness of July 1st, the only sounds the jingle of bit and saber and the endless rhythmic thud of hooves on dirt. They crested a low ridge as the first gray light seeped into the sky. Below them, nestled in a shallow basin, lay Gettysburg. Church steeples pierced the morning haze. Roads, 10 of them spoked out from the town like cracks in a plate. Buford didn't see a quaint Pennsylvania crossroads. He saw a tactical nightmare. The town itself was a trap, low and surrounded by higher ground. But to the west, a long tree-covered ridge ran north to south like a natural wall. To the south, 2 rocky hills rose abruptly from the plain. Hold those heights, and you held the battlefield. Lose them, and you gave your enemy the high ground forever. He led his men down into the town, the clip-clop of hooves echoing strangely on the empty streets. Citizens peered from behind curtains. This was the moment, that split second when you see trouble coming and have to make a decision with consequences you can't yet measure. Buford sent patrols galloping up the roads leading west and north. He didn't have to wait long. A rider came back at a full gallop up the Cashtown Road, the road from the mountains where Lee's army was. The report was terse, terrifying. Confederate infantry. A full brigade, maybe more. Skirmishers in butternut and gray were already forming up a few miles out. Buford looked west. He looked at his exhausted men. He had no infantry. General John Reynolds's First Corps was marching hard but was still hours away. The math was brutal: 2,500 cavalrymen against what was likely the spearhead of 75,000. A delaying action was suicide. A retreat surrendered the priceless ground. He made the call, "Dismount," he ordered, his voice cutting through the morning air. "Form a skirmish line. You will fight on foot." His cavalrymen, trained for speed and shock, became infantry in an instant. They looped reins over fence posts, grabbed their breech-loading carbines, and ran toward the crest of McPherson's Ridge, west of town. They dug in behind fence rails, using the thick trunks of oak and hickory for cover. The morning sun warmed their backs. They could see the Confederate line now, a long, shifting smear of color emerging from the tree line 1,000 yards distant. Buford stood behind his men, field glasses to his eyes. He was buying time with their lives. Every minute they held was a minute closer to Reynolds. Every yard of open field they made the enemy cross was a yard paid for in Southern blood. Then, a single, sharp crack split the morning, a puff of white smoke from a Confederate skirmisher's rifle. The bullet hissed through the leaves overhead. A heartbeat of silence followed, thick and heavy. Then the entire Union line erupted in reply, a rolling volley of carbine fire that shattered the pastoral calm forever. The first shots of Gettysburg had been fired. The 3 days had begun, and John Buford, standing on his ridge, knew the real storm was still over the horizon, marching toward the sound of the guns. The rolling crackle of carbine fire from Buford's dismounted troopers was a desperate, staccato beat against the deep-throated roar of Confederate volleys now sweeping McPherson's Ridge. They were buying time, not ground, and time was running out. The 1st Gray Infantry Brigade, Alabama men under General James Archer, pushed through the Herbst Woods, their advance a solid pressing wall of musketry. Buford's cavalrymen, experts with their rapid-fire Spencer carbines, poured a blistering hail into the tree line. An Alabama officer later wrote the fence rails in front of the Union line seemed to spark and smolder from the sheer volume of lead. But a carbine is not a rifle musket. Its range was shorter, and for every rebel who fell, 2 more seemed to step over him. Then, a new sound cut through the din from the south. Not the scattered fire of a skirmish line, but the deep, rhythmic tramp of thousands of boots in unison. A column of infantry moving at the double quick, their bayonets catching the midday sun. The vanguard of General John Reynolds's First Corps had arrived. Reynolds himself was at their head, riding a dark horse, his face set in a grim mask of urgency. He saw Buford's thin blue line, bent but not broken. He saw the Confederate battle flags pushing ever closer through the woods. Without breaking stride, he turned in his saddle and pointed his sword toward the heart of the fighting. "Forward, men! Forward! For God's sake, drive those fellows!" The men he sent in were unlike any others on the field. The Iron Brigade Westerners from Wisconsin and Indiana, wearing distinctive tall black hardy hats instead of the standard blue kepis. They didn't march to the fight. They waded into it. No pause to form lines, no ceremonial volley. They crashed into Archer's Alabamians in the dappled shadows of Herbst Woods with a savagery that stunned both sides. It was close-range butchery in the undergrowth, a swirling melee of bayonet, clubbed musket, and fist. The black hats were everywhere. Archer, bewildered and overwhelmed, was yanked from his saddle by a Wisconsin private. The Confederate brigade's line, which had been advancing with confidence minutes before, shattered. Men in butternut and gray streamed back out of the woods across the open fields toward Willoughby Run. The Iron Brigade drove them, howling, all the way to a deep man-made gully, an unfinished railroad cut. This was the moment. The shock of a successful, violent charge. The Union had the momentum. But momentum on a battlefield is a fragile thing, a bubble that can pop with one piece of bad news, and the news came riding up to General Reynolds just as he watched his Westerners push the rebels into the cut, a breathless courier pointing north. A new forest of Confederate battle flags was emerging from the trees near the Carlisle and Harrisburg roads. Not a brigade, a full division, maybe more. While Reynolds and the Iron Brigade had been focused on the fight in front of them, a tidal wave of gray was about to crash into their unprotected right flank. Reynolds turned his horse, raising his field glasses. He never saw the shot, a .577 caliber Minié ball, fired from the woods to the north, struck him behind the right ear. He was dead before he hit the Pennsylvania soil. The commander of the Union left wing, the man who had chosen to stand and fight at Gettysburg, was gone. The bubble of momentum burst. Command devolved in a heartbeat of chaos. On the field, the Iron Brigade, now isolated, fought on with a desperate fury. They poured fire into the railroad cut, turning it into a slaughter pen for Archer's retreating men. But the pressure from the north was inexorable. Fresh Confederate brigades, North Carolinians under General Dorsey Pender, slammed into the Union flank. The fighting dissolved into a series of isolated, nightmarish struggles around farmsteads and in wheat fields. The McPherson farmyard became a charnel house. The Herbst Woods, once a place of dappled light, was now a tangled tomb of fallen men in black hats and butternut. The Union line, outnumbered and outflanked, began to crumble from the north southward. Regiments that had stood firm minutes before found rebels in their rear. The order, when it finally came, was not a coordinated retreat, but a collapse. Every man for himself. The phrase echoed across the ridge as regimental colors dipped and fell back. Thousands of blue-coated soldiers, the Iron Brigade, the cavalrymen who had held so long, broke for the rear, pouring off the ridge and into the streets of Gettysburg itself. They became a river of panic, flowing past brick homes and through alleyways, dropping knapsacks and rifles as they ran. Close behind came the triumphant yell of the Confederate infantry, surging into the town's outskirts. The disaster seemed complete, but war has a strange geometry. The very roads that made Gettysburg a trap for defense now funneled the retreating Union masses not into scattering flight, but toward the one place they could still hold, the high ground south of town they had ignored that morning. A bald, rocky hill called Cemetery Hill, there, a new Union commander, General Winfield Scott Hancock, sent by Meade to take charge of the chaos, was already rallying stragglers. He formed a battle line on the crest, his profile a stark silhouette against the darkening eastern sky. The first day was lost. The first day was lost. The ground, however, was not. As the last light bled from the sky over Cemetery Hill, the Union Army began the grim, desperate work of turning disaster into a fortress. General George Meade arrived after midnight, his face haggard in the lantern light of a small farmhouse. He studied the maps, listened to Hancock's report, and made his decision. They would not retreat. They would stand on this line of hills south of Gettysburg, a fishhook-shaped ridge running from Culp's Hill on the right down Cemetery Ridge to two rocky, wooded knobs at the far left. Big Round Top and, just north of it, Little Round Top. It was strong ground, high ground, and by dawn on July 2nd, 75,000 Union soldiers were digging in, their bayonets and tin cups scraping at the rocky Pennsylvania soil, turning fence rails into barricades. Across the shallow valley in the woods along Seminary Ridge, Robert E. Lee watched the Union position solidify. He saw the strength of it. His trusted subordinate, General James Longstreet, saw it too, and argued forcefully against a direct attack. "It is the strongest position by nature I ever saw," Longstreet said, urging a flanking movement to force Meade off the heights. But Lee's blood was up. The victory of the first day, though incomplete, had convinced him of his army's invincibility. He believed one more push, one concentrated hammer blow, would shatter the Union Army and end the war. He overruled Longstreet. The attack would go forward against the Union left flank. The objective was the two round tops. Capture them, and the entire Union line would be rolled up like a carpet. The order set in motion a colossal, clumsy wheel of men and cannon. Longstreet's entire corps, nearly 20,000 men, had to march south, hidden from Union signal officers on Little Round Top, to launch their assault. The march took hours. The sun climbed, a blistering brass coin in a cloudless sky. Dust rose in thick clouds from the narrow country lanes, coating the waiting Confederates in a fine, choking powder. The heat became a weapon in itself. Men collapsed from sunstroke. The carefully synchronized attack timetable dissolved in the July furnace. Lee's hammer blow would be delivered late and piecemeal. The first blow fell not on the hills, but in a peach orchard on the Emmitsburg Road. Around 4 in the afternoon, Confederate batteries opened fire. Then, with a deafening collective shout, 3 brigades of Mississippians and Alabamians emerged from the woods of Seminary Ridge and started across the open fields. Their target was a salient in the Union line held by General Daniel Sickles, who had impulsively advanced his corps into the orchard, creating a vulnerable bulge. The fighting that erupted there was of a scale and ferocity new to the war. The peach orchard became a hellscape of whizzing metal, where blossoming trees were shredded into splinters by cannon fire, and the air itself seemed to tremble. Sickles's line bent, then broke, but the rupture consumed Confederate brigades, bleeding them white in the wheat field and the tangled woods behind the orchard. The hammer was already cracking. The real target, however, remained the hills. As the roar from the peach orchard swelled, a Union engineer named General Gouverneur Warren stood on the summit of Little Round Top. He was there to assess signal station positions. What he saw to the west froze his blood. A butternut-colored tide was flowing through the valley below, its leading elements already beginning to climb the rocky, wooded slopes of the hill he stood on. The Union left flank was in the air. The entire army was minutes from being flanked and destroyed. He saw one Union regiment, the 20th Maine under Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, being hastily marched up the hill's southern slope. It was all there was. Chamberlain, a former professor of rhetoric, reached the crest with his 386 men. The ground was a tangle of boulders and stunted trees. To his front and left was nothing but empty wilderness. To his right, the rest of the Union line dwindled away. His orders were simple and impossible. Hold this ground at all costs. He had barely minutes to deploy his men in a thin line before the 15th Alabama, battle-hardened and desperate for water after their long march, came crashing up the hill. The Alabamians attacked not once, but 6 times. For over an hour, the two lines blazed away at each other across a distance, sometimes less than 30 yards. The air grew thick with acrid smoke and the deafening, continuous roar of musketry. The Maine men fought from behind boulders. Their rifles becoming too hot to hold, the dead and wounded began to pile up, shrinking the blue line. Chamberlain, his uniform torn by a ricochet, moved along his line. He saw the faces of his men, blackened with powder, eyes wide with the strain. He heard the ominous clicks of hammers falling on empty chambers. They were running out of ammunition. The Alabamians, sensing weakness, were forming for a 7th final charge. This was the modern callback made flesh, an impossible task, no good options, and only seconds to invent a solution. Chamberlain looked at his dwindling line, at the exhausted men fumbling in empty cartridge boxes. He looked at the fixed bayonets on their empty rifles, and he gave the only order left. Fix bayonets. The metallic rasp of steel sliding onto lugs ran down the line. Then, in a voice that carried over the din, he gave the next command. The 20th Maine, out of bullets and out of time, was going to charge. The 20th Maine did not charge down the hill. They swung forward like a great hinged gate, the left of their line wheeling around to crash into the flank of the advancing Alabamians. It was a professor's tactic, born of pure desperation. The shock of cold steel and a screaming bayonet-wielding line descending upon them broke the Confederate assault. The Alabamians, exhausted and out of water, tumbled back down the rocky slope. Little Round Top was held, but the fury was just spreading. A mile to the north, where the roar from the peach orchard still thundered, the focus shifted to a 20-acre patch of land known simply as the wheat field. It was a deceptively peaceful rectangle of golden stalks, bordered on one side by a dark wood called the Devil's Den, a jumble of massive moss-covered boulders where Confederate sharpshooters now nestled like venomous insects. The field became a vortex. Over the next 2 hours, brigades from both sides were fed into its maw, one after another, in a series of brutal piecemeal counterattacks. A Union regiment would sweep across, driving the gray lines back into the woods. 10 minutes later, fresh Confederate troops would erupt from the tree line, pushing the bluecoats back across the trampled wheat. The ground changed hands 6 times. The fighting lost all order. As the sun dipped lower, casting long, distorted shadows from the shattered peach trees, the battle in the wheat field devolved into 100 savage, intimate brawls. Men fought with clubbed muskets, the stocks slick with blood and sweat. They fought with bayonets, with rocks, with bare hands in the choking dust. The humid July air, already thick with heat, grew solid with the smell, a nauseating cocktail of burnt black powder, torn earth, and the coppery tang of blood. Wounded men crawled through the flattened stalks, their progress marked by dark, wet trails. The wheat itself was stained crimson, not in patches but in great swathing arcs where entire ranks had fallen. Twilight did not bring peace. It brought a stranger, more terrifying clarity. The smoke settled into a low, glowing fog, lit from beneath by the last red embers of the sunset, and from above by the first flashes of musketry. In this eerie half-light, soldiers became silhouettes, their faces invisible, their movements jerky and nightmarish. Orders were screamed, but no one could hear them over the continuous rolling thunder. Units became hopelessly intermingled. A Confederate captain might find himself bayoneting a man from his own regiment, so coated in grime were their uniforms. It was less a battle than a mechanical slaughter, a grinding of flesh against flesh until one side simply had no more men to feed into the machine. By the time full darkness finally fell, the killing field fell silent, not from decision, but from exhaustion. The wheat field was a no-man's land of groans and whispered pleas. The Union line had held, but it was a battered, bleeding thing. On Cemetery Ridge, men collapsed where they stood, too spent to even seek water. Across the way in the woods along Seminary Ridge, Robert E. Lee received the reports. His grand flank attack had failed. Longstreet's corps was mauled, yet the numbers told a story of Union weakness. They had been pushed to the absolute brink. Lee, believing his army's spirit could overcome any ground, saw only a line on the verge of snapping. He made his decision. The next day he would strike the very center of that ridge. It was the modern callback, written in Casualty Returns, the soul-crushing reality of giving every ounce, only to see the same impossible challenge waiting for you at dawn. He would send George Pickett's fresh division, along with brigades from 2 other corps, across a mile of open field. He was betting everything that one more push would break them. Noon on July 3, 1863, arrived not with a bugle call but with a single earth-shaking crack. 150 Union cannons, lined wheel to wheel along Cemetery Ridge, fired as one. It was the largest artillery bombardment ever assembled on the North American continent. The sound was not a series of booms but a single prolonged roar that tore the sky apart. Windows rattled in Gettysburg homes 3 miles away. Men on the ridge felt the concussion in their teeth, in their bones. The air itself seemed to thicken and punch back. For the next 2 hours, that ridge became a continuous sheet of flame and smoke, a man-made volcano erupting with mechanical, murderous rhythm. Their target was a wooded crest, a mile across the open valley, Seminary Ridge. Nestled there, Confederate Colonel Edward Porter Alexander had managed to assemble 80 guns. His orders were simple: "Silence the Union artillery." As the storm of iron descended, Alexander's gunners replied. For a few minutes, the valley became a titanic, deafening dialogue. Shells screamed across the open ground, solid shot that plowed furrows in the farmland, explosive shells that burst in the air with jagged white puffs. The ground between the ridges, already scarred, began to churn like a sea of mud and flame. But the math was against Alexander from the start. 80 against 150. His ammunition trains, stretched thin from the long march north, could not match the seemingly endless supply feeding the Union guns. One by one, his batteries began to fall silent. A caisson would explode in a spectacular fireball, scattering men and horses. A gun would be dismounted by a direct hit, its crew reduced to red mist and twisted limbs. The crews that remained worked in a dazed, nightmarish frenzy, swabbing, ramming, firing, their ears bleeding, their world reduced to the next shell and the next. On Cemetery Ridge, the Union infantry hunkered low behind stone walls and earthworks. They did not fight. They endured. The air above them hissed with Confederate shells, some overshooting to tear into the reserve lines and ambulances in the rear. For the men in blue, it was a trial of pure nerve. All they could do was press themselves into the dirt, listening to the shriek of metal, the thud of impacts, the screams of the less fortunate. The heat was stifling, the smoke acrid and blinding. Some men simply broke, scrambling to the rear, only to be cut down by the relentless fire from their own side. The bombardment was a test, and the test was this: how much punishment could a man's mind absorb before it shattered? Across the valley, sheltered in the woods, George Pickett's Virginians waited. They were Lee's fresh division, their uniforms still relatively clean, their spirits high with the arrogance of men yet to be bloodied in this battle. As the Union barrage reached its peak, their world dissolved into noise and terror. Shells tore through the canopy, sending down a deadly rain of splintered wood and iron. A single round could decimate an entire company standing in formation. Men were erased where they stood. The romantic charge they had imagined vanished, replaced by the visceral, bowel-loosening reality of modern artillery. They clung to the earth, their faces pale, their earlier bravado leaching away with every passing minute. The grand, dramatic charge was first broken down into its raw human components: fear, prayer, and the desperate hope that the next shell had someone else's name on it. Alexander, his uniform blackened with powder, watched his grand reply sputter and die. His guns were overheating, his ammunition was nearly exhausted. He scanned the Union line through his field glasses, hoping to see signs of the destruction Lee had promised. But the flag of the United States still flew, stubborn and defiant, above the smoke-shrouded ridge. The Union guns had not been silenced. They were roaring louder than ever. A cold dread settled in his stomach. The plan, the entire fragile gamble of this third day, depended on breaking that artillery. It had failed. At his headquarters, Robert E. Lee remained a statue of calm resolve, but the message he received from Alexander was a silent scream. The colonel, knowing what he was asking of the infantry, scribbled a note and sent it to General Pickett. It was not a grand tactical order. It was a plea from a man who could see the abyss opening before them. For God's sake, come quick. The ammunition is nearly exhausted. Come quick, or my artillery cannot support you. The note passed through the hellish landscape, reaching Pickett. He read it, then turned to his division commander, James Longstreet. Longstreet, who had argued against this very moment, looked at Pickett's eager face and could not bring himself to give the order. He simply nodded, a gesture of profound, wordless grief. And then, a miracle of terrible timing. The Union bombardment, seeing no reply, began to slacken. The rate of fire slowed. The thunderous roar diminished to a sporadic, echoing cough. Then, silence. A vast, unnatural, ringing silence settled over the valley. It was more shocking than the noise had been. For the first time in 2 hours, men could hear the birds again, the distant cry of a wounded horse, their own ragged breathing. It was the calm before the storm, a deafening noise followed by a moment of terrible, pregnant quiet that is somehow worse. On Cemetery Ridge, veteran infantrymen knew what that silence meant. They peered over the walls, their hands tightening on their muskets. They began to see movement in the distant tree line, shapes forming into lines, flags being unfurled. The long walk was about to begin. At 3 p.m., under a brutal white July sun, the woods of Seminary Ridge gave birth to an army. From the scorched pines and shattered oaks they emerged, not in a rush but with a dreadful ceremonial slowness. George Pickett's fresh division, joined by brigades from Hill's corps, stepped out into the open light, 15,000 men. They formed a battle line nearly a mile wide, a gray and butternut wall 2 ranks deep. For a moment, they simply stood there, arranged as if on a parade ground, their colors hanging limp in the windless heat. They were exposed, utterly. Before them lay 1,400 yards of open Pennsylvania farmland, a gentle rising slope of wheat stubble, split by fences, dotted with farmsteads, leading directly to the heart of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. Every man in that formation understood the arithmetic. They had to walk that distance. A slow, steady march under fire the entire way. There is a particular hollow dread that comes with seeing the exact ground you are expected to die upon. It is the opposite of surprise. It is a contract signed in advance. The order rippled down the line, forward, not charge, not yet, guide center. The first step was the hardest. 15,000 left feet moved as one, then the right. The line began to advance with a grim, polished precision that was beautiful and horrifying to behold. The sun glinted on bayonets fixed to tens of thousands of rifle barrels, creating a shimmering metallic wave. Their boots crunched in unison on the dry earth, a low, rhythmic thunder. This was the grand, dramatic charge of storybooks made real. For the first 100 yards, the silence held. The only sounds were the tramp of feet, the jingle of canteens and cartridge boxes, the occasional nervous cough. The Union Ridge ahead was a silent blue smudge beneath its battle haze. On that ridge, Union soldiers watched, mesmerized. From the copse of trees at the center, all the way to the anchor of Ziegler's Grove on the right, men in blue peered over stone walls, their fingers resting on rifle triggers. Artillerymen stood by their silent guns, lanyards in hand, counting the distance. The trick had worked. The cessation of fire was not a sign of defeat, but a lure. The Confederate artillery was spent. Their infantry was now alone in the open. A Union officer, watching through field glasses, murmured the order. "Load, spherical case." The command was repeated, gun by gun, battery by battery. The metallic clatter of ammunition chests opening echoed along the line. Gunners rammed home the deadly packages, shells designed to burst in the air and rain down shrapnel. They adjusted fuses. They waited. The Confederate line was a spectacle of doomed discipline. They had covered 200 yards. Officers walked calmly ahead of their men, swords pointed at the ground. The flags, the red battle flag of the Confederacy and the starred blue banners of individual states, began to unfurl as a faint breeze picked up. The men dressed their lines instinctively, closing the small gaps caused by the uneven ground. They moved with the resigned cadence of men performing a duty they know will kill them. It is the walk of every soldier who has ever been ordered into a slaughterhouse, back straight, eyes ahead, heart hammering against the ribs. Then the world ended again. A single Union cannon barked from the center of the line, then another, then 100. The entire ridge erupted in a rolling, concussive wave of fire and sound. The air, so still a moment before, was suddenly torn apart by the shriek of solid shot and the sharper crack of exploding shells. The effect was instantaneous and mechanical. A 12-pound solid shot, a bowling ball of iron, would strike the front rank. It did not stop. It would take off a man's head, pass through his body, tear through the second rank, and mow down 3 or 4 men behind him, leaving a corridor of mangled flesh and splintered bone. Then it would bounce with terrible lazy energy and do it all again. Gaps opened in the pristine lines, not gaps of men falling, but of men disintegrating. One moment, a company of 80 stood shoulder to shoulder. The next, a red mist hung in the air where 10 of them had been, and the men on either side were spattered with what remained. The spherical case shells were worse. They burst overhead with puffs of white smoke, and then came the rain, a downward hail of iron fragments and lead balls. It had no target. It fell on the entire formation. Men dropped as if their strings had been cut, clutching at sudden wounds in their shoulders, their backs, their legs. The orderly advance began to stutter. The lines wavered like cloth in a wind. The neat, rhythmic crunch of boots was lost under the screams of the wounded, the shouts of officers trying to maintain order, and the relentless, deafening roar of the guns. But they did not run. They closed the gaps. The survivors stepped over the twitching, screaming heaps that had been their friends and neighbors, and they kept walking. The flags, now pierced and torn, dipped and then rose again as new color-bearers snatched them from falling hands. The mile-wide line began to curve inward, unconsciously, like a moth drawn to a flame, aiming for the small clump of trees at the center of the Union wall. The focus was no longer on the distant ridge, but on the next 10 yards. Then the next. The grand charge was already breaking down into 10,000 individual acts of desperate courage and blind obedience. The long walk had become a grind through a geometric storm of iron, and they were not even halfway there. The neat mile-wide line was gone. What remained was a bent, bleeding mass of men, compressing inward as if pulled by a magnet toward the small clump of trees on the ridge. They had crossed the first open fields, a hellscape of bouncing iron and airburst shrapnel. Now they faced a new obstacle, one that offered a fleeting, cruel promise of relief. The Emmitsburg Road was not a grand highway. It was a sunken country lane, its bed worn down by decades of farm wagons. To the men in that shredded gray wave, it looked like a trench, a shallow, dusty ravine where a man could kneel and catch his breath. As the forward ranks reached its near edge, they did not hesitate. They tumbled down the gentle slope, breaking formation entirely, seeking the blessed illusion of cover. For a few chaotic minutes, the lane became a tableau of desperate humanity. The air, thick with the chalky dust of pulverized soil and the acrid tang of burnt powder, was slightly cooler below the road's banks. Men collapsed onto their knees, their wool uniforms soaked through with sweat, their faces blackened from biting cartridges. They saw puddles from a recent rain, water pooled in wagon ruts, shimmering with an oily film. They did not care. They scooped the muddy liquid with their hands, with their caps drinking greedily. Their tongues were swollen, their throats raw from yelling and thirst. They tore open their haversacks, not for food, but to press the cloth against wounds or to soak up more water. The road was littered with discarded knapsacks, blankets, and extra ammunition, anything to lighten the load for the final climb. This was the pause. The moment where the sheer physical exhaustion of crossing 800 yards under cannon fire threatened to overwhelm the mission. Officers stood in the roadbed, swords raised, voices hoarse from screaming. "Up, boys, up! Don't stop here!" They kicked at resting men, not in anger but in frantic urgency. To stop was to die. The Union Ridge was now only 400 yards away, and every second in the road made them a better target. The Union infantry had been waiting for this exact moment. From behind the stone wall on Cemetery Ridge, a forest of rifle barrels leveled. These were the men of the Union II Corps, Hayes' division on the right, Gibbon's on the left, anchored at the angle. They had watched the advance in grim silence. Now, as the Confederates bunched up in the road, struggling to reform, the order came. "Front rank fire!" The first volley was not a crack but a roar, a long, ripping tear of sound as 2,000 .58 caliber mini balls left their barrels at once. The effect on the road was catastrophic. At that range, the heavy, soft lead bullets did not just pierce, they shattered bone and tore fist-sized holes through flesh. An entire rank of Confederates, caught in the act of climbing the far bank, was blown backward as if struck by a giant's hand. The neat, desperate work of reforming companies in the lane dissolved into a screaming, tangled chaos. Men were shot while drinking. Officers rallying their units were picked off, tumbling into the mud. Volley fire gave way to independent firing at will. The blue line became a continuous rolling bank of smoke and flame. There was no need to aim. Simply point into the brown haze of the road and the swarm of gray figures beyond it, and pull the trigger. The Confederates were in a funnel, the fences along the road now acting as traps, slowing them as they tried to climb out. For 10 minutes, the sunken lane was not a refuge but a slaughter pen. The water in the puddles turned pink, then red. Yet they came on, driven by a momentum that now had its own logic. Fragments of brigades surged up the far slope. The charge was no longer an army's maneuver. It was a collection of small, leaderless groups, each clinging to a flag as a point of reference. The magnificent, disciplined line had shattered into desperate clots of 50, 20, 10 men, all converging on the one visible landmark, the copse of trees. And at the front of one such clot, a figure emerged through the smoke. Not a young colonel, but a veteran brigadier with gray in his beard, Lewis Armistead. He had served in the old army with Winfield Hancock, the Union commander defending this very sector. Now he was leading his Virginians against his friend's line. His hat was off, held aloft, impaled on the point of his sword, a signal to his men, a beacon in the storm. His voice raw and powerful, cut through the din. "Come on, boys. Give them the cold steel. Come on." With a final convulsive surge, a few hundred men, a mixed remnant of Armistead's and Garnett's brigades, breached the storm. They crossed the last open slope at a run, a ragged, screaming wave. They reached low stone wall, the last barrier. Armistead placed a hand on the topmost rock and vaulted over, his sword still holding his hat high. For one impossible second, he stood inside the Union line. A dozen of his men scrambled over with him, their bayonets fixed. They had reached the angle. Then the world dissolved into close quarters chaos. The Union defenders, men of the 69th Pennsylvania, did not break. They turned and fought with clubbed muskets, pistols, and fists. The fight was not lines of battle, but a swirling, grunting brawl in choking smoke. Armistead was at its center. He took 3 steps forward, his sword swinging down to point at a captured Union cannon. "Turn the guns," he roared. The order died in his throat. A rifle cracked from point-blank range. Then another. He dropped his sword, clutched his abdomen, and sank to his knees. The last sight he saw was the muzzle of the cannon he had meant to capture, now being reloaded by blue-coated artillerymen. With Armistead down, the spearhead of the charge bled out against the stone wall. The few dozen Confederates who had breached the line were shot, bayoneted or clubbed into submission. The rest of the gray tide, seeing no flags advancing beyond the wall, began to falter. The momentum, built over 50 minutes and 1,400 yards, finally broke. A man turned to run, then 10, then 100. The retreat was not orderly. It was a rout. The firing slowed, then stopped. An eerie, ringing silence settled over the field, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the crackle of burning grass set alight by shell fire. The sun, still high, beat down on a scene of utter devastation. From the Union wall, soldiers watched, too exhausted to cheer. They saw a landscape transformed. The neat wheat fields were now a trampled scarlet mat. The Emmitsburg Road was a choked gutter of bodies and abandoned gear. Men in gray and butternut crawled through the stalks, leaving dark trails behind them. They called for water for their mothers, for help that would not come for hours. Over 7,000 men had fallen in less than an hour. On the Confederate ridge, Robert E. Lee sat motionless on Traveler, watching the shattered remnants of his grand assault stumble back. He rode out to meet them. He passed broken men, their uniforms in tatters, their eyes hollow with shock. He did not offer empty praise. He took the blame squarely upon himself. "It is all my fault," he said over and again, his voice steady but heavy. "You must help me." It was the hollow feeling after a catastrophic failure when the person in charge has to face the people who paid the price. The Battle of Gettysburg was over. The Confederate Army would slink back to Virginia, never to threaten the North again. But on that field, the reckoning was just beginning. The long, terrible work of counting the cost awaited under a brutal July sun. The rain began that night, a slow, cold drizzle that turned to a steady downpour by dawn on July 4th. It fell on the bloated bodies in the wheat field. It pooled in the hoofprints and shell craters. It washed the blood from the rocks at the angle, turning the creeks around Gettysburg a faint, sickly pink. The two armies, spent and shattered, stared at each other across the ravaged mile. No muskets fired. It was the silence of mutual exhaustion. Then, that afternoon, a telegraph clicked in the Union headquarters. News from the west: Vicksburg had fallen. Grant had taken the last Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi, splitting the South in two. The double defeat, Gettysburg and Vicksburg, delivered on the same day, was a hammer blow to the Confederate heart. The initiative won at such cost over 2 years was gone. They would never again carry the war north of the Potomac. Lee knew it. His only task now was to save his army. The retreat began after dark, a creeping, agonized procession. The wagon train of wounded stretched for 17 miles, a groaning serpent of misery winding south through the mud. Wheels sank to their axles. The rain-soaked roads became quagmires. Men without wagons laid the wounded on fence rails torn from nearby farms, carrying them until their shoulders bled. Every jolt drew a scream. The Confederates left behind 5,000 of their too hurt to move, along with a landscape of broken rifles, abandoned cannon, and the unburied dead. This was the morning after. The world kept turning. The sun rose on July 5th over a quiet, broken town. But nothing would ever be the same. The high water mark of the Confederacy had crested and receded here. What remained was the grim arithmetic. Over 50,000 American casualties in 3 days. More men fell at Gettysburg than in the entire Revolutionary War. The legacy was written in the soil. Farms were gone, forests shattered, fields sown with lead and bone. It would take weeks to bury the dead, and decades for the scars on the land to heal. The cause for which Lee fought was now retreating, destined to wither, but the Union he had tried to break would endure, forever haunted by the memory of what happened in those Pennsylvania fields and the terrible price of its preservation. You can walk that ground today. The stone wall at the angle still stands, rebuilt but on the same stones where Union soldiers crouched and fired. The field Pickett's men crossed is now peaceful pasture, exactly 1,400 yards from the Virginia Monument to the copse of trees. Most visitors walk it in 20 minutes, unaware their steps trace a path where thousands died in 50. They see markers, cannons, and grass. Nothing of the noise, the heat, the metallic taste of fear. The numbers are still there if you know how to look. 51,000 men fell in those 3 days. That's more than the entire population of the town that watched it happen. You can find the shallow depressions where artillery batteries stood, the subtle ridges of long-filled rifle pits. The land remembers what the plaques can only suggest. Every road from Gettysburg led inexorably to Appomattox. The South's last great offensive was broken in that Pennsylvania field. Never again would a Confederate army carry the war north. The momentum, the hope, the foreign recognition, all of it bled out into the soil of Cemetery Ridge. Lee's army would fight for nearly 2 more years, but it was a protracted, desperate retreat. The cause was doomed the moment the survivors turned south in the rain. This is the weight the place holds. It is the quiet, sunlit field that decided the fate of a nation. You stand where something monumental happened, with only granite and grass to show for it. The silence you hear is the echo of the gunfire that finally ceased. The open sky is the same one that watched 15,000 men march into hell. And the enduring Union, the single nation that emerged from the fire, is the legacy bought at the price of all those vanished lives, forever part of the ground beneath your feet.